Hi, I'm a stick figure programmed to do a 90-degree turn in every transition and I find goodies. Today's goodie is going to be the Brumberg sisters, widely regarded as the quote fairy grandmothers of Soviet animation. But we're not just here to talk about what they've done, we're going to look at the motif of physical revolutions in their filmography, how that connects them to more household Soviet cinema names like Tsiga Vertov and Alexander Rodchenko, and whether or not this motif of spinning helps understand how the Brumberg sisters express social consciousness in their work. Why all of this at once? I don't know, mate, I'm bored. Ready? Okay, let's go. Valentina and Zenaida Brumberg were animators in the Soviet Union during the 20s and 30s, and directed animated films up until 1970. They're generally associated with their work in fairy tale animations, and the initial decades of their career were a time when the Soviet Union was inspired by Disney's animation aesthetics, but did not care for what they perceived as Disney's lack of social consciousness in their stories. In scholarship on the Brumberg sisters and their relation to this mindset of producing films with propagandistic tendencies, their style of storytelling is generally portrayed as more subtle than their contemporaries and inspirations. For instance, in a statement in Michele and Lora Mjolsness' She Animates, where the authors transition from discussing the Brumbergs to Olga Kotadeva, Leigh and Mjolsness claim not all female animators during the 1930s were able to incorporate female-centered narratives into their fairy tales, and some chose to create films with heavy propagandistic slants, indicating that whatever proclivity the Brumbergs have for social messaging in their stories, if you will, it's not readily noticeable. Other biographical sources, such as a chapter dedicated to the sisters in Drawing the Iron Curtain, notes their relative lack of political involvement, especially alongside contemporaries such as Ivan Ivanov, and, quote, tended to assert their influence in less assertive ways. So if these scholars' characterizations are to be believed, the Brumbergs are very much the scalpels to the sledgehammer that is the likes of Kotadeva and Ivanov. Less loud, less bombastic when it comes to social messaging in their work, which makes it all the more fun to try and find them. Unfortunately, to help with that, sources on the sisters are a bit scarce. Secondary sources aren't easy to come by, English primary sources are practically non-existent, and Russian primary sources are hardly legible. But we might be able to learn a few things by looking at some more well-documented figures in Soviet cinema that are related to the sisters and some stuff they've done. Among the avant-gardists that the Brumbergs study under in the 1920s is Alexander Rodchenko, an artist who was heavily associated with constructivism in Soviet film and someone who has collaborated with filmmaker Tsiga Vertov in his Kino Pravda or Film Truth newsreel series. A particular object featured in Kino Pravda 14 that was extensively studied by scholars was a series of revolving inner titles and signs created by Rodchenko, cited by authors as a notable token of Soviet constructivism, which is a school of thought that focuses on art for its social consciousness. Scholars Mihaila Mihailova and John Mackey note two major aspects of the inner title's constructivist nature. For one, there's the contrast, in the sense that you have a device that shows nations that are loyal to the US juxtaposed with the USSR. For another, these items have a, quote, modular quality, meaning they are constructed using items with a uniform quality across, like the 10 identical 9-inch wooden bars used to assemble the inner titles you saw earlier. As a sidebar, Mihailova and Mackey also note that just the fact that these things spin is cause to speculate about their political undertone because they may signify political revolution by using revolving physical objects. This seems like a flimsy argument at first glance until you recognize that the act of rotation in Soviet art has been extensively written about by the likes of Russian formalist author Viktor Shklovsky. Shklovsky asserts that, quote, someone walks down a certain street for 15 years or maybe 30 years. Each day he reads the sign that hangs above a certain shop, nectars of varied colors. And each time he passes it, he asks himself, who needs nectars of varied colors? Well, one day the shop sign is taken down and put on its side against the wall. It is then that he reads for the first time, neckties of varied colors. Shklovsky may not be thinking of the act of physical rotation as indicative of political revolution, but he is emphasizing the importance of rotating objects as an act of displacement, and that is how art can reach and engage with as wide of an audience as possible, which aligns with the constructivist creed of art for the sake of social consciousness quite well. And Shklovsky's writings have been extensively applied to further understand acts of physical rotation in Vertov's work as well. So the notion of physical revolution in film being indicative of real revolutions, or at least a metamorphosis of some kind, is given a bit more credence. And since Rodchenko has been an inspiration for the Brumbergs, it makes sense to compare their works. So do we readily see acts of physical revolution in the work of the Brumberg sisters? Absolutely. Now, if we want to say that there's a layer of social commentary or something beneath all of this, what do these acts of rotation have in common? How do they match up against the constructivist criteria we outlined earlier? Is there a modular quality? Is there contrast? Well, in terms of the moving parts of an object, or in this case animation sequence having a uniform quality, you see especially in their earlier work prior to the introduction of cell animation like in Some Old Boy, where the act of a deceitful shaman physically turning repeatedly uses the same frames for every 2 rotations or so. Now of course animation cycles are not unheard of, but the modular quality is there nonetheless. Now what about this point about contrast within the entity that physically rotates? Well, you'll notice that the characters that undergo the most rotation in the Brumberg's animations are one of 2 things. Sometimes they are flat out deceitful, like the shaman in Some Old Boy that tricks the villagers into thinking that one of his statues has magical powers, or the big bad wolf in Little Red Riding Hood that pretends to be Little Red's grandmother. The contrast comes in when you consider how both of them readily switch between their performed identity and their actual identity. Other times, there's something about them that they don't want others to know about. For instance, in The Lost Letter, this Zaporozhet character that befriends the protagonist supposedly sold his soul to the devil. He doesn't hurt the protagonist at all, and therein lies the contrast of his character. He is a benevolent entity that has a sinister quality that isn't revealed right away. Now, there are some outliers to this rule of only liars and sinister characters spin, like the cat in Little Red Riding Hood, or the protagonist, the unnamed Cossack in The Lost Letter. But these usually aren't nearly as mobile or last nearly as long time-wise. And there are generally extenuating circumstances, like how the Cossack's rotational dance is not initiated by himself, but rather Zaporozhet. Or how with the cat, you don't actually see his body when he spins, but rather he just becomes a blur, so there is much less of an explicit display of physical revolution. Well, you don't see the wolf either when he rolls into the river, but at least the barrel with him inside is always visible, and its rotation lingers on the screen for much longer. So how are the Brumbergs advocating for revolution here, if at all? Well, it's a bit of a difficult case to make because the revolution argument by Mihailova and Mackie is more applicable to Kino Pravda 14 simply because, if for nothing else, the fact that it was released immediately before the end of the Russian Revolution in 1923. The Brumbergs' filmography doesn't begin until the mid-1920s. Maybe we can argue for the Brumbergs advocating for a generally revolutionary mindset, but considering what we mentioned earlier about the characters that initiate rotation and characters that rotate the most being deceitful and sinister to a degree, perhaps the Shklovskian notion of displacement is more appropriate, or if you think that wording is still not the most apt, metamorphosis may be the word for it, considering how once these characters get punished/rescued, their form becomes much more static. It seems that we can derive this message from the Brumberg sisters once we consider parallels between their creations and the creations of Vertov and Rodchenko, as well as how the theoretical writings of writers like Shklovsky are applicable to them. The message being, to have a stalwart society, that which is deceitful needs to change/be displaced.
But who gives a flying F about that ill-researched sack of cripe argument? Did you see the Brumbergs give this big bad wolf what for? They threw in everything except the spinning pile driver for this bastard. What more could you want out of an animation? This anime is really fun!